I was not supposed to film this video today, but I'm pretty sure that I can just ad-lib a whole video about the subject. So,
3 hours later.
Yeah, we are not trying that one again. Every time I post, I get a lot of comments on my tone. And lately I've been trying to post videos about all the things that are crucial, in my opinion, to sounding like me. I've talked about the Ibanez PD7, made a pedalboard video where I go in detail to what each component does to my tone and how I use them together. And now it's time for the most personal thing of them all, my picking technique. I figured out 3 different topics about my picking technique that we will go into today. Because if you want to sound like me, it's not something that you can achieve through gear alone. You also have to play like me. First, we will dive deep into my picking technique. We will cover the basics on how to hold the pick, some theory about picking styles and why they matter, and how hard do you really need to hit. The second part will deal with all the minute things that affect your tone and that you need to be aware of, like pick thickness, pick materials, where to pick, and so on. In the third part, we will shortly go over strings, string types, and what I use. Part 1. The techniques. First up, how to hold a pick. If you've already played with a pick for a long time, I think you might have already found a playing style and pick holding style that works for you, and that's fine. Use whatever style works for you. But if you want to sound and play like me, there's only one style that will work for that, and that is the closed fist style. In this style, you rest your pick in between your extended thumb and your curled index finger. What this will give you is the best support for your pick with the least effort, giving you maximum power transfer from your muscles into the strings. For a lot of people starting out, it might feel more natural to hold the pick the same way you hold it when you pick it up from the floor, aka in between 2 or 3 extended fingers. But that is a really ineffective technique. That way you might have an easier time reaching the strings and doing some string skipping motions, but you will lose a lot of energy due to the fact that your fingers are really far from your palm and therefore they are not supported as well. You will also need to exert much more energy to just keep the pick in place, whereas if you hide the pick inside your palm, it will be much easier since your fingers are supported by each other naturally. Using no more strength than absolutely necessary is a key ingredient in both avoiding injuries and being able to perform longer and better. Holding your pick like this will also enable you to use better muting techniques since your palm is always readily available. If you're agile, you can also try to use some hybrid picking techniques from this position, but I'm not very well versed in those. Holding your pick like this is also the only way you can achieve the correct striking angle towards the strings, which we will be going into next. The attack of an instrument is what most defines its characteristics. If you compared multiple instruments against each other but cut off the first few hundred milliseconds where the initial attack happens, it will be very difficult to accurately tell them apart. But if you hear the attack, aka the very start of the note, it will be very easy to tell apart, for example, which one is a grand piano and which is an acoustic guitar. The attack is the harmonically richest part of the whole note, and hence it's also the most important to nail. There is a widespread idea around on the internet that to get better attack you only need to strike harder, which on the most basic level would make sense, right? More strength, more attack, better. But this way of thinking leaves out one important fact, and that is that not all attack is the good kind. Striking really hard can make your strings choke out and also going sharp in pitch initially, doing that boom tone. And while I do think that a controlled boom can sometimes create a very accurate sense of aggression and danger and being tuned low, it's most often not something that we want. To get the best out of our attack, we'll need to spend the least amount of energy for maximum results while controlling our fast-moving pick and making sure that our strings are not going sharp. So what if I told you that there is one technique that will give us all of these? Join me on a heist as we go into the classical guitar realm and steal a technique called rest stroke. The technique is fairly easy in theory and also quite genius. Rest stroke means picking the string you want and then resting your pick on the next string down. What this will give us is a surefire way to stop the motion of our pick without us needing to expend the energy in stopping the motion. At the same time, it will also allow us to move away from this kind of digging trajectory that we'd otherwise have to do to avoid hitting the other strings. Instead of going down, plucking the string and then pulling the pick up and stopping the motion, we just strike right through the string and let the next string stop us. It is more energy efficient, more straightforward, and also allows us to put more power into our motion because we know that the next string will catch us. It is also a much simpler movement which can help prevent wrist injuries. Just using rest stroke isn't always going to be enough to prevent your string from going sharp, and there's still something we can do to increase the harmonic content in our attack. Right now, the only contributing things in your attack are the pick and your string. But there's a lot of metal on your bass that's just sitting there begging to be used. I'm of course talking about the frets. Slap bassists have known for decades that you can get all kinds of cool sounds by banging your strings against the frets, and now we are going to continue our little thieving journey and stealing that idea as well. When slapping and popping, you are causing your strings to go straight down against the frets and hit them. But since we are using a pick, we can't exactly do that. This doesn't make a very good sound. Again, the secret lies within the rest stroke. While with classical players the rest stroke movement is almost completely parallel to the strings, we are going to take that movement and angle it a lot deeper towards the fretboard. I've found that angling the movement to around 40 degrees into the fretboard will help you get that last bit of extra attack in your tone. This will also help you get away with using thinner strings in lower tunings, since the string will hit the fretboard first, keeping it more in place and limiting its movement. While browsing different bass groups on the internet, I often run into discussions where people are suggesting ridiculous string gauges for fairly standard tunings, something like 0.155 for a low A or G sharp. That's nuts.
Stop it. Get some help.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and argue that a lot of these players suggesting these extreme gauges are simply not picking right. While sure, the string gauges one uses is all about preference, sometimes preferences are not simply preferences, but instead a result of bad practices. In addition to the angle of the picking movement itself affecting your attack, the angle of your pick also affects the way your attack sounds. If you play the pick flat against the string, the pick will hit the string with a lot of surface area and then leave the string very fast with minimal friction, sounding like almost like an open hand slap. Personally, I tend to pick with the pick slightly angled towards the strings. This way, the pick will hit the string with a smaller surface area and then scrape against the string as it leaves. This will give us a more spread out and accentuated attack, which can enable us to lock in better with the groove. When picking this way, it is, however, very important to keep in mind that you should minimize your movement along the string when picking. This can become a bit of a problem, especially when standing up, as many players like to hold their bass a bit more upright, which will then make the natural trajectory of your picking movement go more along the string than against it. Going along the string gives us more scraping and less of the actual note, making our performance a lot messier. Lastly, I'd like to talk about picking hard. There is a lot of talk on the internet about good tone being just you picking hard, and as someone who's had wrist pains from picking so fucking hard, I'd like to go against the grain here. Yeah, sure, to get the right tone out of your instrument, you need to pick with adequate force, but to say that the tone is just picking hard is missing like 90% of the equation. I don't feel like I pick particularly hard. I couldn't. I would mess up my hands and my wrists. In my opinion, the better way to think about this is to think about picking with authority. Authority in this context meaning using the appropriate amount of force and a certain directness. You're not being shy about the strings or the way you play, but you are confident in your playing, in your tone and in your technique. See, the way I think about this is that if you are in the mindset of I need to pick very hard, it is easier to ignore the negative consequences of picking very hard. It'll be easier to ignore your body telling you that there's something going wrong, or just blame your gear for not sounding right, because after all, you are doing the right thing. You are picking as hard as you can all the fucking time. It's the same thing as learning to slap. If you don't immediately focus on getting the right tone with the minimal amount of force, you are going to hurt yourself. Yes, you need to pick with some force, but that amount of force isn't necessarily just defined as just a lot. Instead, it should be defined as the least amount of force to get the correct tone. And with the right picking technique, that amount of force can be much less. Part 2, picks. Now, let's move away from the boring stuff, like techniques that you'll need to practice, and onto the good stuff, aka gear that you can buy. Today we'll be talking about picks. Loyal fans and gear nerds of the channel will know that I've been using these Dunlop Altex standard 0.88mm size picks for a long time now, but I still sometimes liked using these ESP nylon picks for some stuff. These are not something random, but each pick offers me a different tone that I can use to my advantage. First, let's talk about pick thickness and how it affects the different techniques we talked about earlier and your tone. Actually, pick thickness is not a super straightforward topic in itself, since different pick materials have a different amount of give under pressure, which, in my opinion, affects the tone more than the numbers printed on the pick itself. The way your pick flexes under pressure affects how it will attack the string and how fast it will leave the string afterwards and let it resume its movement. If you're using really thin picks, your attack will sound more like a slap, since your pick will hit the string and leave it very quickly. Thinner picks therefore require more force from your picking hand to get the same result. But since they have a lot more give under pressure, they also even out the force applied to the string, even if the force from your hand varies a bit. It's kind of like a natural compressor in that sense. On the other end of the spectrum, thick and rigid picks will give you a much sharper attack, but can also lead to an uneven sounding performance, since they will transmit most of your force into the string, easily resulting in an uneven sound if your picking technique is not 100% there. I've found that with thick picks I tend to get an uneven bass response, even when the sound is otherwise mostly fine. I call this choking the note, and I believe that it's some kind of response to an attack that hit the string too hard or in the wrong way, therefore resulting in the bass response choking out and the string ringing out in some kind of harmonic. If you're also playing hard, according to Newton's third law, you are always causing an equal but opposite force against your hand and your wrist. And since the pick can't bend to absorb some of that force, you are straining your hand and your wrist much more than necessary. For my personal use, I've found that picks varying in thickness between 0.70mm to 1mm work the best for bass. The right thickness, of course, depending on the material of the pick. When using the rest stroke and picking more into the fretboard, I found that thinner picks easily result in my hand striking against the other strings, especially these first few knuckles in your hand. This doesn't seem to cause any extra noise, but it will hurt my hand in the long run, and that's bad. Especially playing live when you need to add some extra theatrics into your performance. Then again, when using thicker picks, you also run the risk of hitting the strings too hard and causing the notes to choke out. So you'll just need to find the right balance for you and not just trust some random guy on the internet. When it comes to pick materials, I tend to go with either Dunlop Altex or nylon picks. And this matters for a lot of reasons. Firstly, the stiffness of the materials is different, meaning that I can use thinner picks with Altex than I can with the nylon picks. The difference in feel between the ESP 1mm nylon and the Dunlop Altex 0.88mm is really small, with the ESP 1mm nylon feeling almost like a 0.93 Altex. Secondly, the tone between these is remarkably different, and this matters especially when you are thinking about your attack. You can demonstrate tonal differences between different pick materials very easily if you have a stone countertop or stone floor or some other hard surface that you can drop these onto. Each pick makes a different sound, and that difference will translate almost directly into the sound of your attack. Dunlop Tortex picks, which seem to be the favorite of many, are quite warm in their sound and have a very spread out attack, which can easily be a good thing if you are looking for a much more subtle bass sound. Nylon picks tend to focus the attack very high on the spectrum, while the Altex sits somewhere right in between those two, with a very focused attack that, for me, sits right where I want it to be. Dropping picks onto a stone countertop or stone floor is not the whole truth, but it will give you a very good insight onto how those picks will sound when you play them. So do that. Go into your local store and drop a bunch of picks onto their floor. They will love you. Pick shape also matters when considering the attack, and in addition to the materials, the shape of the pick affects how it bends. If we choose the Fender 351 shape or the Dunlop Standard, same shape, different names, to be our baseline, smaller picks like the Dunlop Flow and the Dunlop Jazz style picks obviously have a lot more give than the more stiffer triangle shaped picks. Curiously, the Dunlop Altex Sharp or T3 picks also seems to be considerably stiffer than their standard counterparts, even though the difference in shape is tiny with just a little bit of more in the tip of the pick. Since we are playing bass and not guitar, and we actually want to use the side of the pick to create a part of the attack, sharp picks are kind of useless to us. The way sharp and thick picks are meant to be used is with guitar strings and using just the tip of the pick to attack the string. Since we are also using the length of the side of the pick to create the tone instead of just the tip, sharp picks can also be a bit detrimental to your tone without giving any advantages. Often when guitar players switch over to bass, I see them just switching their Jazz 3 picks into the larger Jazz 3 XL picks and call it a day, and I think that's a mistake. Guitar and bass are two different instruments with very different approaches and goals when it comes to tones. And it would be foolish to think that you can get perfect results with both using the same techniques and tools. Lastly, we are going to talk a bit about how where you play affects both your tone and playing feel. You've probably already noticed that picking closer to the neck gives you a rounder and warmer tone, while picking closer to the bridge gives your tone an added brightness. In addition to the difference in brightness, where you pick also changes your bass and mid response, and I'm not necessarily talking about just the amount of bass here. Picking right above the end of the fretboard gives you a much rounder bass response with a kind of hollow quality to it. I've found that this can be very useful when playing indie rock style bass lines, or anytime you just want to have a bit more softer tone. This is also a key difference to why Porcupine Tree's Harridan sounds so different when Steven Wilson plays it and when I play it. Steven hits the strings very far towards the end of the neck, while I play much further back. When moving towards the bridge, you get more brightness in your tone and your bass response also gets tighter. But once we move behind the bridge pickup, we start actually losing some of that bass, and the bass response shifts its focus more towards the low mids. That's a very difficult frequency range to control, and while that tone can be very useful in something like technical death metal, I'd advise to stay away from behind the bridge pickup for now. Since this is a physical phenomenon, it's not really the same as boosting some bass or high shelf on your EQ, but instead a much more complicated process that you can't really fix with EQ afterwards. Where you pick also affects how it feels to play, with the strings being much tighter towards the bridge and much more flexible towards the end of the fretboard. Personally, I like to pick somewhere right in front of where the bridge pickup is on a standard jazz bass. I found that this location gives you the perfect combination of attack, tightness, and bass. Something you also might want to keep in mind when testing different basses is where their body shape naturally places your picking hand and how well they support your picking motion. This is, of course, different whether you're sitting down or standing up, since the angles of your body and your hands change, and should therefore be tested both ways. Precision bass contours will naturally place your hand a bit further back, while the offset body of a jazz bass will place your hand a bit more towards the neck. When standing up, both positions move a bit further back, as the angle your arm approaches the bass changes. Part 3. Strings. In this last part, I want to very quickly touch upon the subject of strings. I think I want to do a longer string video at some point, but you can't have a picking technique video without at least talking a bit about strings, can we? So the topic of today is thinner or thicker strings. The exact gauge will of course always depend on your tuning, but I generally tend to go with a lighter gauge. If you run a ton of bass into a distortion circuit, you will end up with a dark and muddy tone that won't have much clarity. On the other hand, if you run a circuit with slightly less bass into a distortion circuit hard enough, the distortion itself will compress the highs and the whole signal, and you will end up with a more balanced distribution of bass and treble. This is why those guys suggesting insanely thick strings for fairly standard tunings are, in my opinion, digging themselves a trap to fall into later on. All the treble boosting in the world won't give you something that's just not there to begin with. Even though with your technique you might feel like you play better with thicker strings, that really won't matter because no one else will be able to tell what you are doing. One way of kind of getting around the tone loss inherent to using super thick strings is to use tapered strings. The things that affect the tone a string has are of course the material, the way it's wound, the mass of the string, and how flexible it is. Thinner strings are naturally more flexible, meaning that they will bend better around the bridge saddle contact point, giving the string more natural harmonics. Thicker strings, on the other hand, are naturally more rigid, but tapering them at the bridge saddle contact point will make them behave more like thinner strings. If you take a look at a grand piano, for example, you will see that all the bass strings, the super thick strings, are tapered at both ends. Tapering won't result in the same tone as using a thinner string would though. It mostly just cuts away some of the obstructive low mids, which tend to happen when using thicker strings, giving the string a deeper, airier and more articulate tone. The material of your strings will also affect your tone to a certain point, but I've found that once taking into account all the picking techniques and different pick materials, the material of the string has a less of an effect, say using stainless steel strings against similar quality nickel-plated steel strings. Currently I'm in love with the Ernie Ball Cobalts though, since their tone is just incredible compared to anything else I've ever heard. They are so far removed from the way standard bass strings behave that it feels almost like someone put an active bass preamp into my bass, but that's just the way the Cobalt winding works. These strings also last for ages. For example, I have had a set of 45 to 105 Cobalts in my black ESP for almost a year now. For reference, here is how that bass sounded with the standard D'Addario EXL 165s. This riff is from my bass cover of Empire by the great Finnish prog band Wheel. And here is the same bass with the same setup and same processing, just with a Cobalt 45 to 100 set. Immediately you can hear that it's much smoother, still has an aggressive bite to the top end, but with none of the obstructive and papery mid-clank that I would have to clean out anyway. Currently my go-to strings are a 45 to 100 set of Ernie Ball Cobalts for my blue bass, which sits at somewhere around E standard or drop D sometimes. 45 to 105 Ernie Ball Cobalts for my black ESP bass for E standard fingerstyle and slapping. 40 to 95 Ernie Ball Cobalts for my green ESP bass for some F standard madness. 45 to 130 to my green 5-string ESP bass for drop A stuff, and my Dingwalls both use custom tapered sets from New Tone Strings. So this has been my pick bass masterclass for metal musicians. This is all a good part of what makes my tone just work across all the basses and different gear that I use. But the most important thing in finding good tones is your personal taste, aka your ear. While my tones might not be just the thing for you, spending enough time chasing different tones will give you a better understanding on the different relations between your bass, your technique, and the rest of the gear you use, giving you the ability to make better decisions regarding your tones. I have already made a video about the pedals that I use a few years back when building my pedal board together with Rockboard by Warwick. So if you're interested in my thoughts on the gear that I use, you can go check that one out right here, linked in the annotations right now. The next part on my instructional videos will be about tweaking your bass setup for the highest possible performance without sacrificing tone or spending too much money. I am currently finalizing my script around that, but I will also be doing some extra work outside the channel this spring, so it might be a while before that one comes out. In the meanwhile, you can check out my other reviews on the channel. I will put a playlist link right here down at the bottom. You can also hit the subscribe button and the bell button to keep on track when my next videos come out. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye!